Well, hello, Guatemala. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to República for inviting me, and thanks to all of you for your time. I'm afraid I'm going to be addressing you in English because since I'm a typical gringo, my Spanish is very, very limited. So my talk today is going to be about resources, and specifically about the human ability to expand our resource base into infinity. The word infinity will play a role in my talk today. Now, the basic premise of my talk is that more people have more ideas lead to more innovations lead to productivity gains, and more productivity gains lead to higher standards of living, which make the lives of even ordinary people today better than those of kings and queens of yesteryear. The connection between population growth and new ideas, new innovations, and prosperity is a well-trodden territory for which Nobel Prizes have been given to economists like Paul Romer, Robert Lucas, and Michael Kramer. Unfortunately, the beneficial relationship between the number of people on the planet and human well-being is not universally understood or accepted.
The great under-discussed factor in the climate crisis is there are just too many of us, and we use too much shit. Climate deniers like to say, there's no population problem, just look out the window of an airplane, something but empty space down there. But it's not about space, it's about resources. Humans are already using 1.7 times the resources the planet can support. In 1900, there were less than 2 billion people on Earth. Now it's approaching 8. We can't just keep going on like this. The world is just too crowded.
There are not enough people. I can't emphasize this enough. There are not enough people. And I think one of the biggest risks to civilization is the low birth rate and the rapidly declining birth rate. It is, and yet so many people, including smart people, think that there are too many people in the world and think that the population is growing out of control. It's completely the opposite.
There's scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be very difficult, and it does lead, I think, young people to have a legitimate question. Is it okay to still have children?
Well, needless to say, in spite of what you hear from an American congresswoman, there is no scientific consensus that the lives of children are going to be difficult. And let's see if we can answer her question whether it is still okay to have children. So, people have been wondering about the relationship between population growth and resource abundance for a very long time. In 1798, an English preacher called Thomas Malthus claimed to have shown mathematically that resources grow at a linear rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, whereas population grows at an exponential rate, 1, 2, 4, 16, 32. And he believed that the gap between these two rates, resources growing slower, population growing fast, must necessarily lead to starvation. The debate over population growth and resources reached a fever pitch in the second half of the 20th century, when the population of the world, especially in Asia and later in Africa, grew, partly because of additional scientific knowledge and better medical care. In 1968, a Stanford University biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich wrote a very famous book called The Population Bomb, in which he said, the battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Ehrlich scared and scarred generations of people around the world. Some of his ideas were turned into movies. This is a 1973 movie called The Soylent Green. The idea behind the movie is that there are so many people and so little food that every time a person dies, he or she is turned into a biscuit called Soylent Green, which is then fed to the people who are left behind. Note, this is, by the way, the original poster from 1973. Note the date in the top left-hand corner. This is what people thought the world would look like in 2022 when, thankfully, our book came out. Well, it's 2025 and we are still not eating each other. I chose this photo because it reminds me when I go to a store and I'm trying to get some olive oil. I know olive oil is big in Spain, but is it big in Guatemala? Yeah? And certainly in the United States, I have a choice between olive oil from Spain, from Portugal, from the Mediterranean blend. I can get olive oil light, normal, virgin, extra virgin. We are suffering, if anything, from a superabundance of choices. There is so much food in the world, in fact, that famines have disappeared from the world. I'm not saying that people don't go hungry, especially in poor countries. They do. But for millennia, tens of millions of people would die around the world due to regional famines. Food simply ran out and millions of people died. That is no longer happening in the world today. Outside of war zones, where famines are man-made, not given by nature. So in Superabundance, the book that was kindly mentioned, we attempt to quantify the growing abundance of commodities by looking at prices. Rising price of a commodity implies greater scarcity. A falling price of a commodity implies greater abundance. And global prices of commodities, they are basically reflection of the behavior and expectations of 8 billion people. In a sense, you can think about the global marketplace as a giant calculator providing just-in-time, best possible estimate regarding what is scarce and we should be making more of, or that which is abundant and we can be making less of, to just give an example. So I talked about prices. But which prices are we going to be using? There are a lot of prices. You're all familiar with a nominal price. When you leave this conference, you go to a store, you pick up a loaf of bread, that's nominal price. But we all know that if you are looking at a price of a commodity, bread, chicken, beef, whatever, over a long period of time, you need to do what? You need to adjust for inflation. And I chose this picture because this is a picture of a loaf of bread which was on sale in Germany in 1922 during hyperinflation, and that particular loaf of bread cost 1,000 billion Reichsmarks. So inflation matters. If you want to know what happens to a commodity over the long run, you have to adjust for inflation. Unfortunately, both nominal and real or inflation-adjusted price suffers from the same shortcoming. They don't tell you what is happening in your pocket. They don't tell you what is happening in your wallet. We all have grandparents who tell us, oh, when I was a young man, a gallon of gas cost only $1. You can convert it to your own Guatemalan currency. And you say, okay, granddad, that's very true, but how much money were you making at the time? Right? If your income has grown much more than prices, then you are going ahead in life. So that is why in the book we have come up with the concept of a time price. Time price is calculated by dividing the nominal price, the price of the bread in the store, by the amount of money that you are making at the time of the purchase. So, whereas nominal and real prices are denominated in dollars and cents or quetzals, time prices are measured in hours and minutes. Simply put, we ask the following question: how long does it take you to earn enough money to buy something? If today a pound of beef costs you $20 and you are making $20 an hour, then the pound of beef costs you 1 hour of work. If in 10 years' time you are making $40 an hour and the pound of beef is still $20, then you are working only half an hour. You are becoming twice as well off. Why did we choose to measure, in this book, the abundance of resources by looking at time prices? Simply put, because it's simpler. Because we don't know, our book goes back to 1850, what those currencies were back then, what those exchanges were, what inflation rate is, or was, over those 170 years or so. In our accounting, it doesn't matter if inflation is 2% or 2 million %, because you're always comparing nominal price with nominal wages over a period of time. So, to explain it, I'm just going to give you one real-life example. In 1980, a loaf of bread in the United States cost 50 cents. By 2025, that rose to $1.93. So, in nominal terms, bread got almost 300% more expensive. And very often, if you open an American newspaper, because many of our journalists are not as smart as journalists working for República, you will read things like, oh, things have never been so expensive. But that's because they count in nominal terms. And this smart audience knows that we have to do what? Adjust for inflation. So, 50 cents in 1980 is equivalent to $2 in 2025. But we know that bread only cost $1.93, which means that bread got 5% cheaper. Now, one last step, time price. Bread, 1980, 50 cents. A typical blue-collar worker, maybe somebody making a car in the United States, was making $6.57 an hour. So that worker had to work 4.6 minutes in order to buy a loaf of bread. By 2025, bread price increased to $1.93. But our blue-collar worker works, or the wages are $30.84, which means that the worker now only has to work 3.8 minutes. And that means that the bread actually got 18% cheaper. So depending on whether you are working in nominal terms, or whether you are adjusting for inflation, or whether you are taking into account how much more workers are making, you can either be under the presumption that bread is 300% more expensive or that it is 20% cheaper. And I'm happy to say that somebody at UFM, a young economist whom I spoke to yesterday, did time prices for commodities in Guatemala. So I would very much recommend to that young man to publish his findings in República to increase sales, but also to increase the information about how life has changed over time. So, where am I heading with all this? In the book, we looked at commodity prices. There are hundreds of them. In this particular data set, we looked at 50 commodities between 1980 and 2018. This is the period of globalization. This is a period when China, 1.4 billion people, enter the global economy and they consume stuff. India enters the global economy in 1991 and they consume stuff. You have 4 billion people more consuming. And you have hundreds of millions of people who were born into the world also consuming. What happens, or what should happen, when you have many more people being alive and consuming? Prices should go down. In fact, the opposite has happened. The time prices of the 50 most important commodities traded in the world have fallen by almost 82%, which means that instead of 1 unit in that 50 commodity basket of commodities, you now get 3.5. Let me put it slightly differently. Over those 38 years, pork prices around the world have dropped by almost 85%, which means that the same amount of time which got you 1 kilogram of pork now gets you 6.5 kilograms of pork. Are you with me? Okay. So my point is that the average citizen of the world, right now, Mexico is the median global distribution of income. Mexico and China are roughly at the same level, $12,000 a year. Your typical average, ordinary human being living in the world is roughly 72% better off than before. Now, you might ask, is this level of increasing abundance good enough? Or is it too slow? Well, I would remind you that for millennia of human existence, living standards didn't change at all. Your living standard was the same as that of your father and your grandfather, and your children and your grandchildren would have exactly the standard of living that you had. In other words, global economy was stagnant. So I would suggest to you that in this period of globalization, which so many people criticize, including our president, actually the world has gotten much better off. So in our book, we looked at 18 different data sets which contained hundreds of different metals, minerals, fuels, food items, going back all the way to 1850. In this chart, you have population growth on the x-axis, and you have increasing abundance on the y-axis. Note that you don't have decreasing abundance on the y-axis. Why not? Because in no single case that we looked at did stuff become less abundant. Everything has become more abundant. Now, if abundance and population are increasing at the same rate, let's say population is increasing at 1% a year, and abundance is increasing at 1% a year, then we would see all the data points along this 45-degree line. But that's not what happened. In every single case, we have seen that abundance of resources is increasing at a faster rate than population is increasing. The dots on the board are not individual items, they are individual data sets, some of them containing hundreds of different commodities. Okay? So, in our book, superabundance has a technical term when abundance of resources is increasing at a faster rate than population. So, remember this graph which so frightened Malthus. The reality looks the exact opposite. It is resources which are increasing at a faster rate than population. And the gap between the two rates can be explained by the new knowledge which originates in the human mind. So, in our model on which we base the book, the model begins with overall population. Data suggests that only a small fraction of humanity innovates anything, comes up with new ideas. So the bigger the overall population, the bigger the absolute number, the fraction of the human beings who are going to have a new idea. Such as, for example, this guy, a Scottish pastor called Patrick Bell, who in 1828 developed this wheat harvesting machine. Okay, it was a step in the right direction. And over the next 100 years, due to capitalism, due to liberty, due to innovation, you end up with a sophisticated combine harvester which brings down the prices of wheat so that today our supermarkets are filled with affordable bread. But of course, population size is not enough. If population was all that mattered, China would have been the richest country in the world for the last 2,000 years because it's always been the most populous country in the world. But in fact, China was, until recently, dirt poor. It was only after liberalization of the Chinese economy, in other words, steps toward capitalism, that the creative impulses of the Chinese people had been liberated, and that led to the tremendous creation of wealth in China. Question then becomes, can superabundance continue? Can we build more and more and more for more people? So our book talks about an infinitely bountiful planet, which may seem counterintuitive because the planet really has only a finite number of atoms. In fact, most people would probably agree with the American ecologist Kenneth Boulding, who said, anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist. But from a wealth-creating perspective, the number of atoms matters very little. This is a Lamborghini Huracan worth $250,000. And this is a Lamborghini Huracan worth $5,000. Note that the number of atoms is exactly the same, but they've been arranged differently. The first one in an intelligent way, and the second in a chaotic or haphazard way. So human intelligence is vital because it allows us to grow the resource pie. How does it happen? I'm going to go over 9 distinct ways in which the human brain can increase resources. The first and most obvious one is increased supply. If the price of oil, for example, increases, people have more of an incentive to seek profit by going and discovering more oil fields. But technological breakthroughs can also increase supply. So during the old drilling methods, for example, based on the old drilling methods, many of the oil fields in the United States were exhausted. And then somebody came up with the idea of fracking. And many of those oil fields, which were empty, suddenly started yielding more oil and gas, simply because our technology has developed in such a way that we can get to oil and gas deposits that we couldn't before. Electric furnaces, for example, allow us to recycle metal much more. In the old days, if you wanted to grow crops, what you needed was animal, sometimes human manure. Later, because of guano or bird droppings off the coast of Chile, we were able to use guano in order to fertilize our crops. Today, half of humanity depends on a synthetic fertilizer called ammonia, which is based on a Haber-Bosch process developed in Germany. And ammonia is a derivative of natural gas. So all that natural gas, which now you get through fracking, suddenly allows you to fertilize your crops. We can increase efficiency. A can of Coke or any other soft drink that you have used to weigh 3 ounces of aluminum. Today, it's only half an ounce of aluminum. Plastic bottles are 50% less, contain 50% less plastic than they used to. Even our glass bottles are 1/4 more efficient. But you can also increase the absolute efficiency of the economy. So normally what happens is that the use of resources and economic growth go hand in hand. But there comes a point when an economy becomes so sophisticated that actually it keeps growing, but the absolute tonnage of iron, water, copper, and so on starts going down. And that's exactly what happened in the United States. According to Rockefeller University research, out of the 100 most important commodities to the American economy, 41 are post-peak. In other words, we keep on generating economic growth, but we are using fewer and fewer materials, including cropland, copper, water, and iron. You can get increased value from something. When humans started melting sand for the first time in history, thousands of years ago, they discovered glass. And so they used glass for personal decoration, glass beads. Maybe some of the ladies have it here. Later, we discovered that you can turn glass into glasses, such as those on the tables here. Later, we discovered that you can use glass in order to create windows. And today, we use glass in fiber optic cables, and we use it in microchips. So with every step of the way, the value created out of a grain of sand has increased dramatically. Lithium used to be primarily used in ceramics, but today it's used in lithium batteries. Graphite used to be used in pencils. Maybe some of you still write with pencils. But a graphite derivative called graphene actually now makes aircraft. Okay? Another way to increase our resources is to turn something which was useless into something that is useful. When we first started riding motor cars, we needed to drill for a lot of oil. And there was this funny little gas that would come along with the oil. And if you lit a cigarette on a gas rig, you blew up your entire rig and killed all of your friends. That was natural gas. And it was so dangerous that what we did with it, we flared it. We burned it. In fact, today, if you go to some developing countries, if you see an oil rig, there's a little flame on top. What is that flame? That's the natural gas that is being burned. But in more sophisticated economies, what people do is to capture that gas, which is then turned into electricity or into heat, which then powers lighting or alternatively heats homes. So, in a way, everything is useless unless you have the appropriate technological development. Another very important and much underappreciated aspect or economic term is substitution. In the old days, we used to kill whales in order to get their oil, which we would then burn for light so that we could read our books. Or alternatively, we scooped out their brains, which contain fat called spermaceti, and we would turn it into candles. And that's how we would read. But human beings don't care where the light comes from. What we care about is that we get light. And so thankfully, today we have gas and petroleum and nuclear energy that creates light, and we no longer have to kill whales. So that's substitution. We have substituted fossil fuels for killing of whales. Surely that's a good thing. As I described before, we now have synthetic fertilizer instead of guano. When all the wood was cut down in England, because military equipment, furniture, heating was all made of wood, and England was almost completely devoid of trees, we started using coal. And today, forests in England have returned, as they have in the United States, in much of Europe, and also in China. We can substitute synthetic furs for animal furs. And we can substitute different elements. So, for example, a lot of people are now wondering, Elon Musk's cars need lithium-ion batteries. Aren't we going to run out of lithium? But who is to say that in 20 years we'll still be using lithium in order to create batteries to power electric vehicles? Maybe we'll be using sodium-ion batteries. And sodium is one of the most plentiful elements on the planet. Dematerialization. When I arrived in Guatemala and I checked into my hotel, I got Wi-Fi by simply clicking a few buttons on my computer. 20 years ago, I would have to pull out a long copper cable from the wall and plug it physically into my computer in order to get Wi-Fi. We have completely dematerialized access to the internet. It no longer depends on atoms of anything. It just happens through the air. That's what I mean by dematerialization. How many of you have a smartphone? A smartphone is a perfect example of dematerialization. I no longer have a camera, a proper camera to take pictures. I have this. I no longer have a radio. I have this. I don't have an alarm clock. I have this. I still have a TV, but I spend a lot of time watching YouTube videos on here. Imagine the pile of atoms that would have to perform the task which is now performed by an app. That's dematerialization. That's how we take our resources further. In the old days, one of the most frustrating things you could do is to travel to a different country, and you would have to buy books that told you which street you have to go to. And sometimes you would run out of the page, and it would take you to page C174, and then you have to open it there and maybe continue the route that way. Today, we no longer cut down forests in order to create travel maps. What do? We ask Siri or we ask Alexa or whatever else to take us there. So that's dematerialization. Reuse. Of course, except for a few tons of space-grade titanium that we shot up into space, every single resource that the planet ever had is still here. We have almost exactly the same resources that the Stone Age man had. Some of them may be temporarily trapped, doing something. Maybe there's a lot of steel propping up buildings. But that steel is still here. And if in the future we somehow forget how to make steel, we can always get that steel and reuse it. My favorite example is during the Second World War, when Americans were developing the atomic weapon. The only way that they could enrich uranium was through magnets made of silver. And so the American government lent the Manhattan Project 14,000 tons of silver. Today, we no longer use silver in electromagnets, and so all of that silver was returned back to the government. Transmutation. People spend countless years, millions of words, trying to come up with a magical source of transmuting base metals into expensive metals. Isaac Newton was one of them. They were searching for a sorcerer's stone, something that could take lead and turn it into gold. But of course, transmutation is real. 40 years ago, due to neutron bombardment, we were able to turn atoms of lead into atoms of gold. Now, to do it with the current technology, it would cost us quadrillions of dollars in electricity, so we can't do it. But there is nothing in the physical limits of the planet which disable us from turning lead into gold, provided that we have cheap enough source of energy. What about minerals? We already know how to make the most expensive mineral in the world, diamond. Prices of natural diamonds are collapsing. Why? Because our technology has improved. Today we take methane, we heat it to super high temperatures and turn it into carbon vapor, which then deposits one atom onto the next until it creates diamonds. Those artificial diamonds are physically and chemically indistinguishable from natural diamonds. Which is why I believe that all the ladies here eventually will have as many diamonds as they can possibly want. But of course, by that time, it will no longer be a status symbol. Having a big rock will no longer be a status symbol. Women will have to start asking for something else from their fiancés. And finally, should everything else fail, there's always space mining. Thousands of years in the future, maybe we'll need it. But the technology for space mining is already approaching reality. We have anthropomorphic robots that can be powered by AI, and we have the Starship. If those three technologies can mature, then eventually we can go into the asteroid belt, mine for water, or whatever else we want. So, in conclusion, what we really need is more knowledge. And knowledge, unlike atoms, is potentially unlimited. Or, as Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Romer puts it, we consistently fail to grasp how many ideas remain to be discovered. The difficulty is the same we have with compounding. Possibilities do not add up, they multiply. So, the future prosperity of our species is not limited by the physical limitations of our planet, but by the amount of new knowledge that human beings can create. So, in summary, more people have more ideas, which lead to more innovations, which lead to more productivity gains, which lead to higher standards of living. Superabundance, which means the abundance of resources it increasing at a faster rate than population, equals the size of the population and freedom. Without freedom, population doesn't necessarily produce new ideas. In fact, it doesn't, full stop. Now, the replacement total fertility rate is generally considered to be 2.1, but some economists and demographers believe that it's up to 2.2, accounting for higher mortality in developing countries. So let's say total replacement level is 2.1 or 2.2. The current total fertility rate is about 2.2. And that's down from almost 5 in 1968 when Paul Ehrlich wrote his book. By 2050, it will be 1.83, and that's according to the Lancet with 95% accuracy. So by 2064, global population starts to decline. It may be a few years before, it may be a few years later, but ultimately the global population starts to decline. Is that a problem? Well, in our model, it is, because population leads to ideas, which leads to innovation, which leads to prosperity. So how do we fix it? I don't have the answer. I'm just going to talk about a few things. One is there is discussion of subsidies. They're very expensive. Number of percentage points of GDP, and they don't work. As we have discovered, for example, in Hungary, where there's a lot of subsidies going on for childbearing, but actually subsidies have increased the marriage rate a little bit, but they haven't actually increased the birth rate. Another one is to reduce the cost. In the United States, we have a problem with housing shortages. Another and much more controversial way to reduce, or rather to bring young people to have more children, is to stop subsidizing higher education, because essentially what we are doing is keeping young people in the educational system for extensive periods of time. And so they start their families much later, and of course, as you well know, the number of children that a woman will have, of her own volition, of course, decreases with the age in which she starts getting married and having children. And then, of course, there is the question of opportunity cost, meaning this is something on which not everybody agrees, but the idea here basically is that women just have so many other things to do, right? Life is just much more exciting. She could be in Thailand. She could be playing tennis, whatever else. So there's a very high opportunity cost to having children. Not everybody agrees on this, but that's certainly one hypothesis to consider. A different way in which you could increase innovation and resources is by having more people live in freedom, where they can have new ideas which lead to innovation, which lead to prosperity. Unfortunately, political freedom around the world is actually shrinking, so it's going in the opposite direction of what we want. Or we could import the people from unfree countries into the free countries where they can have new ideas which lead to prosperity. Unfortunately, immigration is very unpopular. What about robotics? Well, some people think this has the answer. Others, maybe many in this audience, will find it completely ridiculous and ugly. And that is, of course, robotic nannies, and perhaps even artificial wombs. The idea here is that we already have incubators, and you take it a step further and produce an artificial womb where the child can gestate and then being taken care of by a robotic nanny. Now, some of you may think that that's a techno-optimist way of allowing women to do with their lives what they want, go to work, have fun, etc., and at the same time have children. Others may find that to be absolutely dystopian. What about AI? It's certainly possible that artificial general intelligence will have new ideas. It will come up with surprises. It will give us ideas which will result in greater productivity gains and greater prosperity. But if we are going to get to general intelligence, we have about 40 years to do it before the population starts going down. And finally, we could try to have a cultural shift, that instead of saying that babies are a bad thing and bad for the planet, we say that babies are a good thing and good for the planet, and that every additional human being in the world is actually a great blessing. Cultural shift, it's difficult to pull off, but that may be an option that we have to consider. So I don't have the answers, but I hope that I showed to you that population growth and the number of people in the world are important, and that they are actually beneficial to the planet and also to the world as a whole. Thank you very much.